Wrestling with God, episode number 7. Welcome back to another episode of the Wrestling with God podcast. I'm so thankful for all of you who continue to listen and support the podcast. We had a few new 5-star ratings over the last couple weeks, so we're up to like 22, I think. But only one person actually left a review since the last episode. Everyone else just clicked the 5 stars and moved right on. So thank you so much for the 5 stars, but also please leave a brief review. That's so others will be able to get an idea of why you like the podcast, and they'll be able to see if it's a fit for them without actually investing 30 minutes into listening to it. The review was left by Angel Akers, and she said, quote, "Awesome word, awesome man of God, well worth the time," end quote. And then she left a 4-star rating. So Angel, shoot me an email and let me know what I got to do to get a 5-star rating from you if awesome isn't enough. I'm just kidding you. Very grateful for the review. iTunes is our friend, so if you want to support this podcast in any way, shape, or form, please go to iTunes now and leave us hopefully a 5-star review with some details about what it is that you enjoy about Wrestling with God. And speaking of Wrestling with God, I think this is going to be the most challenging episode to date for all of you. Let me start off by asking you a question, and really consider this. If you were gay, how would you expect the church to treat you? How would you want the church to treat you? Or what if your child came out of the closet to you? How would you want them treated by the church? How would you treat them? Well, our guest today was a homophobic Christian for most of his life. He felt called to a journey that would answer those questions for him personally. What does it feel like to come out of the closet as a gay man to his church and his family? So Timothy Kurek is a straight man who came out as a gay to the whole world. He pretended to be gay for an entire year. It was an experiment in empathy to what it must be like. He had to know, and he wrote a controversial book about that year and his discoveries, and it's called The Cross in the Closet. You may have already heard him on MSNBC, CNN, The View. He's been everywhere talking about the book over the last year. But today we get a little bit more into how it affected his beliefs. And I'm not going to keep you any longer, Grapplers Church. Let's grab a hold of God and not let go. I am absolutely and uncontrollably excited to introduce our guest today, Timothy Kurek. Timothy, are you ready to wrestle with God?
Oh, absolutely.
I had a strong inclination that was going to be your answer. Timothy is a Portland, Oregon-based author and speaker who is tackling some of the front burner issues of our day. And that's why it's a clear choice that he would make for a great interview here on the Wrestling with God podcast. He's a former student of Liberty University, I believe. From reading the book, I hope I'm all right in saying this, of maybe a former religious bigot, as myself was.
Absolutely.
And the author of a somewhat or very controversial book, I guess the way you would look at it, came out last year. This book, the Archbishop Desmond Tutu says, is a gift for us all. And, Tim, this may come as a shock to you, but there may be a few of our listeners who are not going to agree with your theology.
Yeah, that's not a problem, because I probably won't agree with, a lot of their theology either, so it's all good.
Right. Well, it makes you an ideal interview for this podcast, because we definitely want people who challenge us to think differently, people who challenge us to wrestle with God. And actually what I'd like to do is I'd like to just start by reading a quote from your book.
Okay.
I found this on page 196, and you said, "When Christians begin to question whether options 1 and 2 might both be false, and consider the possibility of a third or even a fourth option, they are often swiftly labeled by their fellow church members as heretics or emergents." And I just want to say to you, from my personal experience, I have gone through that. Mm-hmm. And that is a major reason that I started the blog, that I planted the Grapplers Church, that I started the Wrestling with God podcast, because there just seems to be, how should I say it, no space out there for people to honestly doubt, for people to honestly question. no permission to follow the truth if it leads somewhere outside of those church walls. Mm-hmm. And we need a place to be transparent. So I'm a huge fan of yours. I have really appreciated the book. It has definitely challenged me to think outside the box. I'm very thankful to see young men like yourself who have the courage to step out and take such a risk and to be a voice. And all that being said, for those who don't know, why don't you take just a little bit of time here and talk about this controversial book titled The Cross in the Closet? How did it come to be, and what's it about?
All right, yeah. So I was raised in the Bible Belt South, Nashville, Tennessee, to a strict conservative Christian family. We were independent Baptists, so to give everybody who may not be familiar with that an idea of what that means exactly, I was taught to believe that Jerry Falwell and the Southern Baptists were liberal. So very hardcore conservative Christians. I was pretty much taught that anybody outside our church walls or anybody outside our kind of quote-unquote denomination had it wrong, that they were not of God, they were not, that their spirituality wasn't viable. And more particularly, though, I was taught that homosexuality was, kind of a capital S sin, kind of a scarlet letter sin, if you will, that was worse than, almost anything else. I mean, if you've ever been in a really conservative church, when homosexuality is talked about, they liken it to, they talk about it in reference with murdering people and stealing and some of the more notable quote-unquote sins out there. And
demon possession, reprobates.
Yeah, exactly. And so I was raised with that mindset. I went to Liberty University for my first year of college, ended up leaving after that, dropping out for family reasons, and then got involved actively in a conservative church, a little bit less conservative than the one I was raised in, more non-denominational. And it was still very much an anti-gay, Christian. And I had a friend of mine come out of the closet as a lesbian, and she was just brutally excommunicated from her entire life. She told me, she was bawling her eyes out on my shoulder and telling me about how her dad said, "I'm not going to pay for the education and, room and board and everything of a faggot daughter." And her mom said, "Come back when you're fixed." So she had to drop out of college and move to another state to live with and be with the one friend that she had that wasn't under her parents' thumb. And it ruined her whole life. My response wasn't much better than her family's. At that point, I felt like I had a real gut check, a spiritual aha moment, that maybe that voice inside my head telling me that it was my job to sit back and convert her or explain those 6 Bible verses that I was taught always, referred to homosexuality, declared that she was an abominable person. Maybe that voice wasn't God. Maybe that voice was 2 decades spent in a hyper-conservative Christian church. So I had this kind of radical light bulb moment where I realized that the only way I could question whether or not that was true, and the only way I could ever undo the potential damage that I had done was to experience for myself how the label of gay would impact my life. If I could empathize in a very real and tangible way how, 3 letters, a one-syllable word, would impact my external life. So in January of 2009, I came out of the closet as gay to my friends, family, church, my whole community, but I am straight. And I lived with the label of gay for an entire year, a little over a year, and immersed myself in the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community of Nashville, Tennessee. Did everything from serve coffee as a barista at a gay cafe to participate in a gay softball league, protest in New York with a gay rights group. I did everything I could and experienced as much as I could I could find out tangibly if those things that I was taught were accurate or not. And what resulted was the book, The Cross in the Closet, where I talk about how I essentially wrestled with God and what God taught me through that experience about his LGBT kids.
Wow, and this book to me was fascinating from the first time I discovered about it. And when I first heard about it, just from the perspective of wrestling with God, of being a truth seeker, of seeking my own change, even from a writer's viewpoint, man, I just thought you struck gold. And honestly, I was so jealous. I was like, man, why didn't I think of something this cool, this challenging, this radical when I was younger? That being said, I thought that until I got to the page where you came out of the closet to your brother. And at that moment, man, I put myself in your shoes, and I tried to picture doing that with my own older brother. And it hit me in the gut. And reading that, I said to myself, Timothy is nuts. I could never have gone through with that. I couldn't have done it. So I got to ask you, man, can the book even do justice how incredibly insane and difficult that year was?
Oh, no. There are no words to describe what I went through during that year. The emotion, when I came out of the closet as gay, I was actually going into the closet as straight. And so what I hadn't realized going into it was the fact that, the external stuff was going to happen, but much more tangible. Wow, I've used that word like 6 times so far. What was more real and fleshed out for me, what I had experienced the most viscerally, was the experience of cutting off my entire self from the world and having to put this mask on and change, even these tiny little behavioral kind of nuances that are common to me as a straight man, like checking girls out at the grocery store, talking to people, flirting, trying to go out and date. I'm single, don't have a wife or kids or anything. And I was only 22, 23 when I did the experiment. And not only that, but then just not being able to, all the stuff that the label brought with it. My faith wasn't looked at as valid. I was just this abomination in the eyes of most of my community. So, it was a lot more. If I had written the book, though the first draft of the book was probably 2 or 3 times as long as the final product. And if I could go back and write it again, there'd be no way I could capture it. So, it was nuts. It was absolutely nuts.
Man. And speaking of being... But the book itself, there's one thing I kind of want to address before we go any further in it. And let's step away from, now we kind of unveiled what the book is about. Let's step away from the gay issue for a moment.
Okay.
And this, you talk a lot about, and I really liked it, you've got like this character, the Pharisee, that you have these conversations with in the book, this other side of you. And I got to be honest. Of course, I have that Pharisee too, my own version, and even reading the book, there's portions in it that you cuss, you get drunk, you're smoking cigarettes, and these aren't part of the undercover issue. This is just you being Tim, and I know people who aren't going to read the book just because of that. I know people that are going to say to me after I get them to read it, I'm going to suggest they read it, and they're going to say, well, it's evident by his lifestyle that he's not even saved. Of course, he's not going to see anything wrong with the LGBTQ community. So I guess what I'm saying is and I know you understand this being brought up in that ultra-conservative background, that you've possibly alienated some of the people who might actually need this book more than the rest of us. Was that choice hard for you to be that transparent? And what would you say to those critics?
That's a really good question. I actually haven't been asked that question on an interview before, and I've done 300 or 400 interviews at this point. So that was a tough decision. I had a really awesome literary agent who handled some of the biggest name Christian authors out there, who, when I presented the first draft of the book to her to go out and shop it around with the publishing houses, denied me and turned me down and actually ended our contract because it wasn't safe enough for a lot of Christian readers. And I had the option of rewriting it and taking a lot of that stuff out, or I had the option of keeping it and severing that contract and acting as my own agent. I chose the latter. And I think Christians are a lot of Christians are so focused on behavioral quirks like that they can't see the forest through the trees.
Sure.
It's one of those things where you really have to understand that I had to understand that if I wanted to be honest, I had to put those things in there. And one of the reasons that I talk about drinking in the book so much was actually because when I was going through the experiment, spent the first part of the experiment mainly at gay bars. And that was a coping mechanism, in a lot of ways for what I was going through. And that's a coping mechanism for a lot of people. If the church deems you, ungodly or, outside their little comfy sphere of things.
Mm-hmm.
You turn to the alternatives because you don't almost subconsciously know what to do. And for the record, I didn't smoke cigarettes in the book. I smoked clove cigars.
Cloves, yeah, correct.
But not to say that I don't smoke cigarettes occasionally, but I definitely think that the Christians who have an issue with that need to wake up. Jesus' first miracle in the Bible was to turn water into wine, and not just wine, but strong wine. Let's if that's the problem for you, let's focus more on the stuff that matters as opposed to the fluff that doesn't, and try to see through to people's hearts the way that the Lord does, overlooking our faults and our issues, and so that's kind of the mindset I took with that, and I hope that it wasn't enough that it wasn't too much that it pushed too many people away, but if I was going to be honest and authentic, I knew I had to put that stuff in.
I appreciate it so much just to give you my perspective, and I know a lot of people won't agree with it, but we were talking before the podcast on the phone, and I was telling you about a hard time I went through in my life a little bit in Brazil as a missionary, and when I kind of had my breakdown, I can remember standing in the living room crying and saying, I just wish somebody would get in a pulpit and be transparent.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something I think is so needed in the church. Whether I agree with you or not, I want you to be authentic. Mm-hmm. And I want you to be transparent about things. And don't be one thing in the pulpit and another in your house or in the community or with your family.
Yeah, and I've never even I've never in my life met a conservative pastor that doesn't drink, at least in private, and doesn't cuss when he gets angry, and doesn't, struggle with the same things that anybody else does. I mean, I was originally going to call the book Jesus and Drag. I've got a chapter in the book called Jesus and Drag, which is a very kind of off-putting title it would have been an off-putting title for a lot of people. But the metaphor behind that was that when I went to church, I put on this face and this facade of righteousness, and I essentially was dressing Jesus in something that he wasn't, because Jesus is inside of me as a believer. I'm covered by the blood. So I would go to church and I would live this inauthentic life. And so the reason I wanted to call the book that was because I wanted to show that there's this mask that we all put on from time to time, just so that our image and our reputation looks squeaky clean, and that's complete crap. Everybody at church is dealing with the same things that everybody outside of church is dealing with. And, I really got sick while I was in ministry of everybody pretending that everything was all hunky-dory when, a few weeks later when they weren't in church, we'd hear that, oh, yeah, he, so-and-so ran away with his secretary or so-and-so lost his job and is now using drugs to cope with it.
I think even people being so pretentious and wearing that mask and acting like everything's okay and not being authentic and acting so holy, for a young Christian, that was hard on me because they raised the bar so high, and I thought that was a reality. I thought they were tiptoeing through the tulips every day and Jesus was just on their side. And so every time I messed up and I fell to a carnal sin, or I got angry and hit my thumb with a hammer and cussed, or whatever the issue was of the day for me, well, then maybe I wasn't saved. Maybe I wasn't cut out to walk this thing out. Maybe God wasn't with me because everybody else seemed to be getting through this so easily, and it was so hard for me.
Well, it makes grace so much more of a beautiful thing if you understand your shortcomings and understand that even in spite of your shortcomings, everything's been taken care of on the cross. What good is it to live a lie and pretend to be something you're not, when the things that you really are the things that make God so much greater, in having saved you from it. So, people are people, and everybody has issues. I mean, there are statistics out there. I mean, just as many believers get divorced as non-believers, just as many people in the church look at porn regularly as people outside the church. People are people. Just because you go to church a few times a week and read your Bible doesn't mean you're not going to struggle and you're not going to, suffer through the same things that a lot of people do. And I think that's one of the lies of the church ultimately is, if if you come to Jesus, you won't know pain. You'll be different, you'll be new, you'll be set apart, and you won't have to deal with all this crap that you're dealing with, now as an unbeliever. And, when, in my experience personally, getting saved just made it worse, so,
yeah. Yeah.
Before that, I didn't really think about it. It wasn't something that I dwelled on, or I didn't beat myself up for, I wouldn't have beaten myself up at least for using a cuss word or anything like that. But you get saved,
right.
And it's like, oh, great, now I'm constantly not good enough. And, you realize you're never good enough. That's not the point. The point is that he is good enough, so.
Yeah, I thought about, you actually have another portion in the book. I actually read the book, too, as you can tell.
That's awesome.
Another portion of the book, you talk about the 3 weeks that you didn't masturbate after watching The Passion of Christ. And I busted out laughing reading that. But it is right on topic with what we're talking about right now, because even in that moment, I thought about the word repent. Yeah. And that movie stirred up emotions in all of us, just like a church service does, just like a good gospel song does, just like anything that kind of motivates us emotionally. And I think that's why people get so addicted to church and to gospel music and to preaching, and because they need something to keep them elevated, to keep that discipline, to push them through till the next service, to carry over. And because we've been taught, and this is how I was taught, and I'm not sure if it was this way where you came up, but that repentance means to turn away and walk the other direction from sin. But the word actually means to change one's mind. Mm-hmm. And that was a big revelation for me, because it's not so much about letting church get us so hyped up that we have the discipline to carry us through the next week, or we get so emotional, convicted, or overwhelmed that we feel guilty. But it's allowing the Word of God, His holy Word, and the law to show us absolutely what disgusting, vile creatures we are, and throw ourselves at the foot of the cross. Yeah. That's the good news.
Absolutely. Yeah, and here's the thing, like we were also talking about before we started the podcast, it's so many people fall into the trap of legalism, of Pharisaical thinking, or go to the opposite extreme and don't realize that there are certain standards in faith that we're supposed to uphold, and there are things that are wrong that we shouldn't do. I mean, I've got a friend who's a minister, and this particular friend has told their children that it's okay to try it before you buy it, to go out and sleep with people before you get married and stuff like that. And, I'm not saying that I'm perfect and that I've maintained that, but I have an ideal set that, that kind of behavior is wrong for me, and I won't, I strive not to do that in relationships, because I want to bring as little baggage into my future, marriage as possible. And a lot of people look at me and think, oh, you're so conservative, and you're so this or you're so that. But then the conservatives look at me and they say, well, you don't believe that being gay is a sin, so you're a heretic and you're abominable and just like them, and you're teaching lies and you're a false prophet and you're going to hell. So it's like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, because you're in this middle ground where you try to follow your conviction and what the Spirit leads you to, and you have certain standards for yourself, and you hold certain beliefs, but it's never going to please either side. You're either too liberal or too conservative. But that's why I know that that's why I feel so comfortable with where I'm at in my faith, because I see the extremes, and I've lived both extremes, and I was always convicted when I was in either extreme of that extreme kind of belief system. And I think there's a middle ground that we should strive for that's very stable.
Yeah, I had the exact same conversation with my wife. I remember, the point saying that I don't fit in with the world, but I don't fit in with the church anymore. Where do I go?
Yeah.
Where's the place for us? And I remember, and reading that, I thought a lot about on page 230, you talked about the unhealthy extremes. Mm-hmm. And I think it was Martin Luther, John Wesley or Martin Luther. One of them had a quote about it's like being a drunken cowboy. Mm-hmm. They fall off one side, which would be the legalism, and you try to prop them back up off the horse, and they fall off the other side, which is grace.
Yeah.
And like I said before the show started on the phone, that, I had dealt with that for sure myself, being very legalistic and very arrogant and prideful in my religion, and then finding my place self at the bottom, and then just really throwing myself at grace. And then that was probably, I got to be honest with you, man, more than the gay issue, the fact that you brought up, we leave one extreme and we think we found salvation by being awakened to something else, but then we become prejudiced against the original extreme we were on. And that is challenging. That's really the hard part to walk out.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's hard for me because I have a lot of very liberal Christian friends and a lot of people that aren't, saved. That and I hate using that word because it's so us and them. But I have so many friends that are completely polar opposite from how I was raised in my life. When I hear them talking about conservative Christianity, and sometimes I hear myself doing the exact same thing, speaking with such vitriol and such hatefulness. One thing I try to make clear in every interview that I'm in, just because somebody's a conservative Christian doesn't mean that they hate gay people. It just means that they adhere to a certain interpretation of Scripture, and they came to that through their own study, or they were taught that, and their parents were taught that, and their grandparents were taught that, and so on. It doesn't mean that they're not totally nice, that they won't totally take anybody in and feed them and clothe them and love on them and enjoy them, and that's a hard thing for a lot of LGBT folks to understand. They throw the baby out with the bathwater because they've been hurt by Christians, and so I try to challenge more progressive people, and I try to challenge LGBT folks when I'm speaking at a predominantly gay church or at a conference, to look at their actions and their behaviors toward those conservative people that are voting against their right to marry their partner or adopt their kids or whatever, to look at those people the way that they want to be looked at themselves, treat those people with the same respect they want to be treated with. Because you can't have a conversation without having a respectful dialogue. And, as my friend Chad says that, nobody's ever changed their belief because they lost an argument. So
yeah, that's a great point. Do you think I wrote a post, a blog post a while back, and I think it was called "The Dark Side of the Church," and I had found online a tombstone that actually had the guy's name, and it said, this was his title under his name, Christian Slave Owner, and that just sparked something in me to write that blog post. And because there was a time when Christian men who prayed, pastored churches, read the Bible, were sincere in their faith, owned slaves.
Oh, yeah.
There was a time when Christian men were racist and believed in segregation, when Christian men, and even today in some small backwoods places, don't stand for interracial marriage. They won't permit it.
Well, Bob Jones University didn't allow interracial marriage till I think 2001, or interracial dating on their college campus. So,
wow.
Yeah.
So on the gay issue, do you think in, 40 years or in 80 years, like I look back on that and I go, how could the church be so stupid?
Yeah.
And do you think in 40 years or 80 years that the church, our kids, our grandkids are going to look back on this gay issue and go, how could the church be so stupid? Is this the dark side of the church for our generation?
I believe so. Now, that's my opinion, and that's what I feel I've come to. But I totally believe that's the case. There's people, men and women of God, have always used their faith to justify their own beliefs on whatever. I mean, I was in Sydney, Australia in January speaking at a conference, and I was told about there's a famous church with a monument, and this is considered to be a really pious pastor, and the monument says that every Sunday after the church services he'd go out hunting Aborigines because they were looked at as like basically a little bit highly developed apes. And and I think that even Jerry Falwell at Liberty told us the story of how he used to be totally for segregation from a spiritual perspective, taking a spiritual stance for segregation. So yeah, I think that when the time comes, will look back on it as that. It seems that if you look at church history over just the past 100 years, there's this kind of precedent for prejudice in the church where we always have to have somebody that we're prejudiced against. And originally, it was the blacks and segregation. And then, when JFK was running for president, we were freaking out because a Catholic was going to be president. How could we ever let a Catholic be the president? And that happened. And so we moved on, and eventually it got to divorce. Well, then we realized that 50% of our congregations were getting divorced, and we couldn't keep the church doors open and pay the bills if we alienated all our divorced parishioners. And so they moved it, up to the homosexuality. And so we have this tendency, instead of dealing with our prejudice and the fundamental reasons of why we have prejudice in the first place, we just shift it to another group of people, and we use that group to raise money for our cause. Every single time something happened, in equal rights with gays, the moral majority would put out millions of leaflets and send out ads, and they would raise millions of dollars trying to freak people out about the issue. Oh, hey, give us money because we need to fight this harder. And instead of, say, taking care of the poor with that money and doing the most basic thing that the Bible teaches us to do, which is to take care of those with less than us and to, give what we have to them, we're given this kind of armchair activism mentality. And it's really caused the church to go off topic and off gospel and lose a lot of the reach that we once had to do good in the world. And so, and it's funny because you were saying that people go get this spiritual high, they get this, I saw the Passion of the Christ, and I had to put that in there. I thought, oh my God, I'm going to get crucified for mentioning masturbation and the Passion of the Christ in the same sentence. But
yeah,
to me, it rang true because every time I was tempted to masturbate, I started thinking about the Passion of the Christ, and it made me feel this level of shame that kept me from doing it. But eventually, that wore off, And
yeah.
I think we've just lost our focus, and we dwell on things that don't matter as much anymore. And I think there's this movement in the church that being a part of our local communities and serving other people is, while we take care of our own personal lives with Jesus and our own personal relationships with Jesus, that's the better way to go. And I think that's taking hold, and a lot more people are figuring that out.
Yeah, and you said on page 222, you talked about loving God being the highest thing, and then loving your neighbors yourself. Mm-hmm. And I said this in a podcast before. I hate to repeat myself for the listeners, but I had a conversation with my wife one night. I was sitting in bed and reading that passage of Scripture, and I just shut the Bible and kind of welled up some tears in my eyes. And I told her, I said, I could spend, they asked Jesus, what's the most important part of all of this? Mm-hmm. And he said, it's to love God with all your heart and your neighbors yourself. And I said, I could spend the rest of my life working on the most important thing, and I'm never going to arrive. Mm-hmm. I'm never going to love God enough. I'm never going to love other people enough. I'm never going to arrive in that area. So why am I getting distracted by all these side issues when I'm, the most important ones I need to focus on? I can spend the rest of my life just working on those too.
Absolutely. And we don't understand the good we can do and the impact we can have doing something as simple as being really friendly and making conversation with the person, with the cashier checking us out at the grocery store, or when we go to a restaurant, tipping 50% of the bill, to the young lady who may have a kid at home and she may be a single mom. We could bless people with the most seemingly mundane things and show Christ in our behavior that way. It reminds me of when Prop 8 was up on the ballot originally in California. The church mobilized, the Mormon church and the Catholic church and the evangelical church mobilized thousands upon thousands of volunteers to go door to door. They spent millions of dollars trying to influence the vote. And what happened? It got passed, and the Christians rejoiced, and the Mormons rejoiced, and the Catholics rejoiced, and everybody rejoiced. But that didn't stop Adam and Steve from going to bed that night. Except that night, Adam and Steve were going to bed hating God and hating his followers because they had just undone something that politically and constitutionally speaking should be available to everybody. You know, it's like I said, it's armchair activism. Like, we focus on these things and we tie our faith and politics into each other, and we do what we can do with the least amount of effort and pat ourselves on the back. You know, when the right thing to do is to love our neighbor as ourselves and to do, you know, the best we can for the people around us and honor God with our actions towards the other. So
yeah, I think so many times our actions more so draw a line in the sand and absolutely are not Christ-like. When you were saying that, I was thinking back, and some of my friends, I have ultra-conservative friends as well, and they're going to kill me for saying this, but they were so proud of themselves for going to that Chick-fil-A day.
Oh, God.
And supporting that. And to me, it was just an embarrassment. I got to be honest. And I think the best thing would have been for the church, if they wanted to do something like that, they can come together and say that man has that right to believe that, and we support that. But if you want to represent Christ, what you should have said to the gay community, I think, is on this day, we are all going to gather there. And if you want to show up, lunch is on us. Let's sit down and get to know one another.
Yeah.
And that's what you've been talking about, that, you know, we have these prejudice. We made these people our enemy that we don't even know.
Yeah.
And then that line is drawn in the sand, and now that community is looking back at us and seeing us as the enemy, and they don't know any ultra-conservative Christians, and everybody has these preconceived notions of who the other are, and I don't think that's how Christ would have did. I don't think he would have drew political lines.
I don't think he'd go to Chick-fil-A, to be honest with you. Beyond the fact that it's crappy chicken, you know, no offense.
I'm a pescatarian, so.
Yeah, that whole situation was the perfect example, and I'm glad you brought it up. It's the perfect example of the us versus them mindset that's being bred and perpetuated in both communities. Yeah. Because what happened was LGBT folks then arranged sit-ins where they would go in and make out with each other and flaunt their homosexuality, you know, trying to take a stand for it. And they didn't realize that maybe if they didn't flaunt it, maybe if they just said, hey, listen, you know, yeah, you have the right to believe what you believe. We're not going to support that belief with our money. We'll go to Wendy's instead. But more power to you. It's a free country, you know, like, let that be that, you know. People have to make a show of it. And then the Christians, you know, I think Huckabee was the one who the politician started that. And I was thinking, great, yeah, make a marginalized group of people feel even more marginalized. Yeah, that's Jesus. That's what Jesus would do. But what we've got to realize is that there's this us versus them mentality, but the problem is we are them and they are us. Christ doesn't want us to be separate from them. He wants us to all be in each other's midst. How can the gospel move forward if we're not in community with each other? You know, how can we serve our neighbor if, you know, we only isolate ourselves and live on a street with other Southern Baptists? You know, it doesn't work. You know, and then we have pastors saying, you know, one pastor notably saying, I wish we could just put all the gays in one concentration camp and the lesbians in another, and we'll just drop food in there, and eventually they'll die out, and there'll be no more gays or lesbians. You know, and I was asked in an interview about that, and I just said, well, if, you know, straight people, you know, and conservative Christians don't want there to be more gay people, they need to stop having kids.
Right.
they're you know, they're what there is. But, you know, it's this mindset of hating each other, and we don't even like to say, we'll say, oh no, we love these people. We just don't believe that what they're doing is right. But then we go out and we intentionally marginalize them politically and socially and make a big fuss about it. If you want to eat Chick-fil-A, go to Chick-fil-A. I don't care. Like, I'm not going to, and I know a lot of people that won't, but like, who cares? It's chicken. When it became more than chicken, we proved how stupid we really are as a culture.
And here's the irony I think, and I pointed this out to a couple of my friends. I told them, you drove your Ford down to Chick-fil-A, walked in and bought a Coca-Cola with your MasterCard debit card. Yeah. You gave money to 3 companies that are gay friendly.
Yeah.
that support gay rights to stand with one company who's against it. Now, how stupid is that?
And you drank Starbucks and you eat Oreos. If you want to boycott all the organizations that are pro-gay, then you're not going to be able to go to the grocery store. But so I have no problem. I think that the real problem with the Chick-fil-A thing, not to keep going with that, but the real problem was that not only did he make that stand about gay marriage, it was the fact that he's given money from the profits, and you can Google it, you'll find it really super easy. He gave money to the man who is the big proponent of the Kill the Gays bill in Uganda. So they weren't just taking a stand against gay marriage, they were actually helping to fund the organization that is the leading organization that are proponents of the Kill the Gays bill in Uganda, where they are still, westernized culture and westernized religion has come in and influenced them just enough, but not so much that they won't still kill you for a dumb reason with a machete or something. So people are losing their lives and they're being imprisoned for life for being gay. And Chick-fil-A supported that by donating money to it. Now, it may have been a small amount of money, but it's not a big deal. They supported that. Whether it was advertently or inadvertently doesn't matter. They supported that. And that's why I don't, spend money there. But so I think if people look deeper, there's always, a more complex reason as to why. But we waste so much time doing really stupid stuff, and we alienate ourselves from the other, which hinders our ability to spread the gospel and to do good for our neighbor, which is what Jesus said was the most important thing, And, the Bible also says that pure and undefiled religion is this, to take care of widows and orphans in their time of need and to keep yourself spotless from the world. So, taking care of the other and keeping yourself in check, that's pure and undefiled religion. Not the Southern Baptists, not the Episcopalians, not the Lutherans, not, whatever. It's a personal thing. So it gets really frustrating.
Yeah, it does. Let's kind of shift focus here to tie it up at the end. I know I've kept you on longer than I originally booked you for, and I appreciate that. On page 181, you talked a little bit about community and that the church had a lot it could learn from the community, the gay community. Mm-hmm. And I thought about that. I mean, I've seen things in gang life that there was more loyalty and commitment and community and the sharing. I've even been involved in, martial arts clubs and communities that we built really strong family-like ties. Mm-hmm. And you knew those people were there for you. In some of these places, these odd places, more so than I ever did at some churches. Mm-hmm. And then I laughed again on, I think it was like 229. Let me see if I marked it. At page 229, you talked about the cheesiness, basically, of the cookie-cutter churches. Mm-hmm. And all the things we're doing and how it's really predictable and they all look the same. After this experience, after having lived in both worlds, a common question that I'm talking to my pastor friends about quite a bit is, man, what does the church, what should it really look like? What should community really look like? Because they know it's not this cookie-cutter church planting thing that's going on. Yeah. And having lived on both sides of the fence, how would you see merging the two? I mean, what should, in your mind now, authentic Christian community look like?
I think that if you look at it from a biblical context, we need to get away from the idea that the church is a building or an organization and start looking at ourselves as the church. Where two or more are gathered in my name, there I am also. We are the church. We're the vessel of the Holy Spirit. And in Acts, the church was this organic group. In May, I was in Rome speaking at I got to speak at a high school in the room that Mussolini spoke in, and I got to speak the next day at the first ever Protestant church built in Rome. It was awesome. Well, I was there. I was hanging out at the Colosseum, and they had the Constantine exhibit. And I kind of shook my head because as I was reading through everything, I just had this realization that I feel like kind of like the end of Christianity as it should be was when Christianity was made the state religion of Rome. When the church was given money and power and prestige and authority in the, as part of the government system, which ultimately was his way to control people. I think that's when we lost it. When it went from, hey, if you've got a cloak and an extra cloak in your sack and somebody's cold, give them your extra cloak. That's church. When you get together and you pray or you sing songs to God or you share struggles you're going through, and you pray with each other, and you encourage each other, you hold each other accountable in bad decisions, you make. Like that's church. So my view of Christianity becoming the church again is probably completely unfeasible, because my idea is us taking church back from the state and putting it back in our living room or back in our backpacks, and realizing that we're the church, and that means that the church is going to be as unique as every different person is unique. That how we express church and how we live church is going to be so vastly different from what we see in a denomination. I'm not trying to knock denominations here and say that they can't do any good, because they do a lot of good. But we need to go into our churches on Sunday mornings or Wednesday nights or Sunday nights or whenever, and realize that the expression of church is in large part an expression of ourself, with the Holy Spirit involved. And, I go out and hang out at a local tavern here called the Parkway Tavern with friends all the time, and drink beer, and we talk about God, and we talk about our faith. Sometimes we talk about the weather and sports. Sometimes we talk politics. But when we're together and we're fellowshipping, we're doing church. And I think that that's the expression of faith that is meaningful to a lot of people that are outside faith. When they see a Christian that's actively serving their community and actively serving the other. And, I've got gay friends who have a lot of really close friends that are hyper-conservative Christians, the way I used to be, that they have loving, fruitful relationships because that person does church the right way. It's not, hey, come to our building. It's, hey, let me buy you dinner and talk. And so I think that's where it ultimately needs to get back to. This whole hipster mentality of let me hold a Starbucks cup in my hand and read my NIV Bible off of my iPhone or iPad when I've got a gallon of hair product in my hair and I'm wearing all the Abercrombie clothes I can put on my body, and I'm playing a song where the same lyric flashes on the screen 5,000 times in a 5-minute period. That's not church.
Right.
Church is when we go out and we sacrifice for the other. And so conservative or liberal, I think that you can believe what you want as conservatively or as liberally as you want to believe it. That's fine with me, as long as you're doing what Jesus commanded that we do, which is to, like we said earlier, love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, love your neighbor as yourself. If you're doing that, that is going to be expressed in such a visual and fruitful way that it's going to draw people to the gospel and to God and not push them away. So, that's my 2 cents. It'll probably never happen, but, we'll see.
I hope it comes to fruition in my life, that's for sure.
Absolutely.
It's a beautiful imagery, and I really, really like that answer.
Probably idealistic.
Yeah.
Probably idealistic as heck, but I just think there's so much to it. I've got a friend who's saved, who just lent another friend like $200 because a check wasn't coming in and they were going to be late on their car payment, and that person just went on and on and on about how amazing my friend was for lending them the money and getting them out of that bind, and didn't say, hey, I'll lend you this $200 if you go to church with me. Just, hey, take this, pay me back when you get your check, and we're good. That's the gospel in action.
The market employees that we use to trick people into coming to our churches.
Can I say one thing about market employees really quick?
It's a whole other podcast, but go ahead.
The church that I was a worker at, that I was in ministry at, would do raffles with door prizes and give away iPods. And at one point, even because it was about to be summer, raffled off a canoe and life vests and paddles to try to draw people into the church. It was
wow.
It was disturbing stuff. So.
A mentor of mine said at one time, he told me, so we've got everything from bodybuilders to belly dancers in the pulpit because we've lost the true power of God.
Oh, amen.
And that was always challenging to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know that you're out in a park?
Yeah, I'm out in Wright Park right now, which is in Tacoma, Washington.
In Tacoma, Washington. So you probably didn't carry a copy of your book with you out to the park.
Actually, I've got the ebook on my iPad. So
is it the same as the paperback?
Yeah, yeah.
In every aspect?
Yes, it should be. Is there
Well, the final note, try to flip to the back of it.
Mm-hmm.
If you go down about 5 or 6 lines, the only name with a nickname, Scott Gringo Blair.
Ah, I see you. Is that
So,
you?
brother, I just wanted you to know that before you ever published it, I was following you with the Outlaw Preachers and on Facebook, and I went to the Indigo and I sewed money into it, and I've been excited about it. And so it honestly, I mean, not sound like a groupie, but it's been a joy and a pleasure and just a real treat for me to have you on here, because I've been following this project since before it even came to fruition.
I have no idea how much that warms my heart, brother. I couldn't have done it without so many amazing people along the way, and I'll tell you what, you know, it was most definitely the biggest year I've had, you know, wrestling with God, and the years following that as well. So, you know, having people sowing into that, you know, I've got the coolest job in the world. I get to tell people that God loves them for a living, you know, on The View, on MSNBC, CNN, you know, all over the place. So it's an amazing thing, and we might have some more big news coming up here in the next few months involving two really potentially huge projects based off the book.
So anybody that wants to stay in contact with you and follow you and get this big news, what's the best way they can do it online?
The best way is to go to facebook.com/Timothy Kurek, TimothyKurek, one word. And on Twitter, it's Tim_Kurek. Those, I'm always online, whether it be my phone or internet, and I respond to every email personally. So time consuming, but very much worth it to connect with people. So if anybody has any questions or wants to yell at me for anything, that's the way to do it.
Yes, contact Tim. Don't contact me. Just attack him, yell at him.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Please don't attack the humble host.
He's used to it. I'm much too docile and timid and sweet, so please don't yell at me.
Yeah, just be ready for an actual conversation if you do, because I'm more than willing to converse, and I'm not new to that one.
So final parting piece of advice for us, Tim. There's going to be a listener who's grown up in an ultra-conservative home, mm-hmm. and they can't go out and do this fabulous experiment, and they can't write this book because you already stole the idea from us. So they're wrestling with God, and they're like, you know, the Pharisees on one shoulder are whispering to them, saying, you know, you can't buy into this, and it's just deceitful. But they're challenged to kind of find their own faith and wrestle with God themselves and come into their own understanding, their own relationship with God, and get off mom and daddy's coattails and find their own salvation, basically. What can they do? What would you suggest for them to do? How would you advise them to start? Or, I mean, they can't, obviously, all of us can't do the experiment you did, but what do you think would be healthy way to start that process? I
think the absolute easiest way to do it, and the way that I wish I had known to do it, I wish I hadn't been such an extreme case where something as drastic as my experiment was called for. If you're a Christian, whether you're conservative or liberal, we believe that every human being was created with the imago Dei, the image of God. So whether that person acknowledges it or not, they were born in the image of God. If you want to know about somebody who's Mormon or Muslim or gay or whatever you may have an issue with, the best thing you could possibly do is put yourself around those people and learn from them. Don't go in there with an agenda. Don't try to change them. Don't try to modify them. Don't even invite them to church unless they ask for it. Just get to know. Sit at their feet and learn from them about who they are. It's going to open your eyes more than anything else possibly could, and you're going to get to see that the black and whites that you've been taught are nowhere near as beautiful as the rainbows that are out there. And there are many examples of in that rainbow that will drastically shake, change, and encourage you in your faith.
If you haven't picked up a copy of the book, I encourage you to do so. Some of you, it's going to challenge. Some of you, it's going to make mad. Some of you are going to love it. And I want all of you. Don't be afraid of that. Don't be afraid of being challenged. Don't be afraid of being upset. Go out and get a copy of it and give us your feedback. And Tim told you he's open for a conversation with you. You don't have to see eye to eye, but he's open to have that conversation. So once again, Timothy, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, there it is, Grapplers Church family. There is no way to even scratch the surface on that topic or that book in under an hour. But I hope that you did find it challenging and will allow yourself to wrestle with God on this topic. I will link to the book and Timothy's website in the show notes at grapplerschurch.tv/Timothy Kurek. That's Kurek, one word. I have some more amazing guests that I will be interviewing in the next couple weeks, and I think you are going to be really excited about those upcoming episodes. I look forward to hearing all of your feedback on this podcast, as always, and until next time, grab a hold of God and don't let go.